Imagine a world transformed by a tragedy so vast, it ripples across centuries. How High We Go in the Dark isn't just a story, it's a mosaic of interconnected lives, each shaped by the lingering echoes of a pandemic. Set in a near and distant future, this novel weaves together a series of short stories, each offering a window into the granular, intimate impacts of an event that reshapes humanity. Some moments are heartbreakingly tender, like a father grappling with the loss of a child. Others are quietly devastating, as people navigate loss, resilience, and the haunting question of how we rebuild after everything has changed. But what makes this book special isn't just its grand scope or futuristic imagination, it's how it balances the colossal with the personal. You'll find yourself laughing in one story, grieving in the next, and marveling at how humanity's smallest connections persist, even in the face of unimaginable change. In today's video, we'll dive into this stunning work, exploring its themes of love, loss, and the ripple effects of the choices we make. And, as always, we'll read an excerpt to immerse ourselves in this uniquely woven narrative. Let's start at the beginning of How High We Go in the Dark, where everything is set into motion. A scientist, deep in the Arctic wilderness, stumbles upon something extraordinary and catastrophic. As the ice melts and ancient secrets emerge, so does the harbinger of a future that will ripple through generations. This moment not only grounds the novel in its eerie, speculative world but also reminds us of the fragility of our own. Let's dive into this passage and see where it all begins. You're trying to bring those ancient viruses back. We need to understand what's coming out of the ice as it melts, Dave said. Most of what we're finding poses no threat to anything but amoebas, but that 1% of uncertainty is why I'm out here. The more we know about these pathogens, the better we'll be able to defend against them in the unlikely event they become a problem. Kind of like ignoring history. You can try, but it'll probably bite you in the ass later. The more we know about where our illnesses come from, the better we can prepare. And if you bring something back that's in the 1%. I imagine prehistoric microbes crawling over Dave and his team, through their hair, inside every orifice, and suddenly became aware of a leak in my boots. I would have thought even a 1% risk would have warranted more funding for protective suits. We try to stop it from getting out or we prepare people, he said. We get the world to wake up and pay attention to the fact that all this ice melting and the millions of years of shit it contains has to go somewhere. Dave reached for his belt buckle, twisted the metal square, pulled out a tiny flask and took a sip. But the odds of us finding some completely foreign runaway pathogen that we don't already know about are incredibly small. Later that day, I returned to the compound to continue my examination of Annie, carefully turning her over, cutting into the husk of her skin to prepare samples of tissue and bone marrow. Dave and his colleagues off-site were planning to run DNA and viral analyses. It's okay, I caught myself saying, as if Annie could hear me or feel my fingers as I cracked open her rib cage to inspect her hardened organs, black as the stone walls that kept her hidden. I was about to remove her stomach when Mickey texted, "Don't repeat the same mistakes as she did. Yumi only has one childhood. She's already lost her mother. I won't. I'm not. I'm here trying to understand Clara," I responded. "Yumi will want that, too, someday." Mickey sent a photo of Yumi at the zoo, another of her napping, one of Yumi and her cousins biking through Golden Gate Park with giant sun hats and air pollution masks during a recent smog-free San Francisco Challenge week. I was happy for the update, but I didn't have anything else to say. I set the phone down and returned to my work. I was living at the edge of the world and everything else seemed like a distant dream. I pried open Annie's mouth and found traces of crushed flowers and pebbles that evaded our understanding of Neanderthal and early human migration routes, too far a journey and distance for a young girl. The mysteries of Annie continued to compound as I explored the stories hidden in her body. Internal examination notes, stomach mostly empty but contains traces of marmot and several plants, notably Silene stenophylla, narrow-leafed campion. Low amounts make it unclear whether ingested for sustenance or as treatment for illness. Teeth and gums in near pristine condition with traces of wood found between molars, indicating possible dental care. Samples of plaque indicate a diet rich in plants, animals, and insects. Unidentified bacteria beneath gum line in addition to variants of Streptococcus. Signs of cerebral edema preceding cranial trauma. Cranial trauma exacerbated by deterioration and thinning of parietal bones and skull base. Genome results and analysis forthcoming from Far Eastern Federal University. Rigor mortis had curled her fingers. I imagined her asking for help, if her family had possessed medicinal knowledge of plants that could potentially redefine our knowledge of early humans. How do you sing a lullaby in Neanderthal? Mickey and I first started caring for Yumi during her 5th Christmas, when she and her father came to stay with us. Her mother was on a research trip. I'd stay up with my granddaughter to give Ty a break, watching cartoons as she completed her breathing treatment. The wildfire smoke aggravated her asthma. Sometimes I'd fall asleep with her in my arms, and wake to Ty holding a breakfast tray. I'd watch Yumi and her father making weekend plans, a bike ride, dinosaur exhibit, ballet class, and remind them to take lots of photos because Clara was missing it all. It seems like another lifetime that a coroner pulled my son-in-law out from a metal drawer. I had to identify his body after it was spotted floating in Baltimore Harbor by some diners at a dockside restaurant. At first, they thought it was a seal. By then, Ty and Yumi had been living in our converted garage apartment for over a year. She had just started kindergarten and he was struggling to find steady work, freelancing as a graphic designer for local restaurants and cashstrap.coms whenever friends passed him a lead. "Hey, Pops," he'd say. "What do you think about this logo I made for that new Thai restaurant down the street?" Always enlisting my feedback, as if I had an artistic bone in my body. "I'd eat there," I'd say. Or, "Maybe this place should give you a full-time gig." And sometimes Ty would ask, but always the answer was no. He'd moved to the West Coast with Clara after attending college in Boston to give Yumi a better support structure and was never able to find his footing. "Don't worry. Next time," Mickey and I would tell him. "The next interview, the next freelance gig will lead to something steady." He never complained, always asked too little. So, when he wanted to leave for the weekend to attend a friend's wedding, we paid for his ticket, told him to go have fun. 2 stab wounds. No witnesses outside his hotel. I had just tucked Yumi into bed when we received the call from Ty's friend. Clara was silent for a long time on the phone when I told her. She didn't cry, she asked me how Yumi was doing, if she knew. I told Clara that I didn't know how to tell her. "When can we expect you back?" I asked. In my mind I saw her packing her bags and booking a ticket. "I'll be there as soon as I can," she said. But she missed the funeral despite Ty's family delaying it for nearly 2 weeks. They simply couldn't wait any longer. When she finally arrived, I picked her up at the airport and dropped her at the cemetery to visit her husband's urn niche, waited in the car for nearly an hour. After that, she moved through our house like a ghost, continued to work on her laptop. She cooked and ate alongside us, saying little, leaving the house for hours to clear her head. I'd later find dozens of movie ticket stubs in the trash, crumpled letters to us and Yumi that never progressed beyond a few words. Maybe it's time. I know I've been. I want you to know. I watched her over the following weeks, slowly packing and donating all of Ty's belongings. One of the few things she kept, a photo of the 2 of them and Yumi celebrating Yumi's 3rd birthday at Disneyland. I wanted Clara to feel the loss. Mickey and I worried we'd somehow failed in raising our daughter. But here in Siberia, I read her journals and realized she dealt with loss in her own way. She had a plan, and maybe when Yumi was older, she would have been able to come home and say she played some small part in making the world better. Day 68. Dear Yumi, the team went into a nearby village today and we saw a girl that reminded me of you. Her mother and father were holding her hands, all 3 of them bundled up to their eyeballs, waddling over the ice. Your father and I took you ice skating once. You probably don't remember, but you pushed a metal walker across the rink, grasping it for dear life. But then your father took off your skates, held you in his arms, and the 2 of you flew around the rink. I miss him. Maybe I should have stayed longer, explained better. But all I can do right now is remain here, so very far from where I want to be. Maybe it'll all be worth it one day. Maybe it won't, and we'll have lost all this time, and your grandfather will have been right. but know that what I'm doing here is trying to give you a future filled with light. After I finished Annie's examination, I went outside to join Maxim and Dave for a cigarette. The temperature dropped quickly at dusk. I tried to inhale without inviting in the cold like when I was younger, and smoked outside of bars and restaurants, meeting people through our shared nicotine exile. I hung back for a moment as Dave practiced his Russian with Maxim, watched the sky as it transformed into an orange haze over a never-ending sheet of fresh snow. Somewhere, at that moment, footprints in powder recorded the day of small animals and the slow migration of bison. Somewhere, 30,000 years ago, perhaps the snow recorded someone who loved Annie, walking far away from here. Beautiful, isn't it? Maxim said. It is, I said. And depressing as hell, Dave said. It's Siberia, Maxim said. We didn't realize Clara had a daughter, Dave said. Maybe he doesn't want to talk about this, Maxim said. I breathed the smoke in deeply and fell into a coughing fit. Maxim handed me a flask, which I gladly sipped to cool my throat. It's okay, I said. She's almost 10. I pulled out my phone, showed them photos of Yumi and Clara and Ty, all of us together. It's tough having those kinds of connections out here, Dave said. Pretty sure my marriage has been in the shitter for a while now. Any updates on how long the quarantine will be in effect? I asked. We've seen some reaction from amoeba test subjects to the virus that we found inside Annie. It's like their cytoplasm began to either seep through their outer membrane or crystallize. We're not telling our governments just yet. We need to know what we have first, what it might mean, if anything, for humans, Dave explained. Don't want them overreacting. Maxim handed me the flask again, told me they'd make a Siberian out of me yet. If I closed my eyes, I could imagine Clara standing at the edge of the crater, looking back through the darkening forest, searching for a speck of light from the outpost. A week later, mainstream news outlets called Annie another missing link and the wonder girl of ancient Siberia, after the analysis of her genome was completed. Part Neanderthal and part something only superficially human, she possessed genetic traits similar to those of a starfish or octopus. What exactly this would have looked like in Annie was unclear, but the frail girl I previously imagined would have been highly adaptable to whatever the Ice Age had thrown at her. She was a fighter. She was filled with possibility. Most of the lab buzzed with video interviews and celebrations, the promises of research grants and new equipment. No news of the virus within Annie had been publicized, and we'd been instructed not to reveal anything. Dave and Maxim grew increasingly busy, trapped in their labs despite their assurances to us that everything was under control. I wondered if Clara would have told us about any of this had she lived. I video called my wife and Yumi. They were both wearing construction paper crowns when they answered. I said I would be home soon, maybe a month or two, and I wanted to believe this was true. Yumi had been chosen to play the son in a school play and had started taking violin lessons. My wife's sister and brother-in-law had moved in to help, since Mickey held regular art shows in New York, and other relatives stopped by on weekends, resulting in regular potlucks. I sold 2 paintings of Clara and Yumi, my wife added. A couple in Brooklyn said they could sense the love between them, and also a kind of longing. I didn't intend that, but I couldn't help noticing the sadness in Clara's eyes. I think she was happy out here, I said. When Yumi chimed in after, I told her about an extraordinary girl who had the lungs and heart of an Olympic athlete, and who may have possessed the ability to heal from minor wounds in a matter of hours like a starfish or an octopus. Like a superhero? Yumi asked. Kind of, I said. But you said she got sick. Everyone gets sick sometimes, I said. And that's why I need to stay here for a little while longer. I want to make sure people don't get sick if they don't have to. But you're okay? I'm okay. After Yumi left the call, I reassured my wife that what I had said was true. I told Mickey to make teriyaki beef for the next family dinner, to soak it in sauce overnight in the fridge, and to cut the meat extra thin because that's how Yumi likes it. I promised I would call if anything changed. At night I wrote to Clara in her journal, instead of watching The Goonies or The Shining for the umpteenth time. Most of the researchers had dispersed to their own pods as the quarantine dragged on, as winter storms limited our research to the domes. The outpost alcohol and cigarette stash ran low between supply drops. Some took on new hobbies, learning how to play chess, crocheting, drawing, magic card tricks. Yulia was sketching a group portrait of the entire team. I opened Clara's notebook one night and wrote "You were right" on the interior cover in big bold letters, circled and underlined. Dear Clara, it's strange to think I've started to build a life in the same place I saw as your escape from home. But you saw something else, and I think I understand now why you never could rest. It wasn't about us or a job or all the little things we call a life. You saw a future of dead soil and dead oceans, all of us fighting for our lives. You had a vision of what life would be like for future generations and acted like the planet had a gun to our head. And maybe it does. I was always so proud of you, but it took Siberia, quarantine, and the mystery of a 30,000-year-old girl to help me realize that. Maybe tonight I'll look at the stars and make up a new constellation for the both of us, a woman standing at the precipice of a great chasm. I'll be here with you. Love, your father. Sometimes, late at night, Yulia and I overheard Dave and Maxim talking in Russian as we were finishing our evening game of chess in the common room. They tried to be covert, but voices ricocheted off the walls around here. She'd translate what little she understood around the scientific jargon, video conferences with medical and government officials, reports that a strain similar to the Batagayka virus had been found hundreds of kilometers away in soil and ice cores. But no one had gotten sick, and so maybe we were all okay. Perhaps we possessed an immunity to the illness deep inside of us because some of our ancestors had fought the virus. Dave reiterated this to us all: unless we're taking shots out of lab test tubes or snorting infected amoebas, we shouldn't be overly paranoid. But they're still going to keep us here, Alexei, the mechanic, said. They can't keep us here if nothing is wrong with us. Actually, they can, Dave said. Right now, we're their best bet for learning more about the virus. We looked at the amoeba samples under the microscope every day. Maxim and Dave explained any changes, how the cytoplasmic structures inside them had begun to disintegrate. We watched a rat injected with the virus inexplicably slip into a coma. It's like the virus is instructing the host cells to serve other functions, like a chameleon, brain cells in the liver, lung cells in the heart. Eventually, normal organ function shuts down, Dave explained. There's still no reason to think any of us are infected, though, or could be infected. There's also no reason to think that we're not, Yulia said. You said you haven't seen anything like this before. We should have left it alone, one of Maxim's assistants said, pointing to Dave. Everything will be your fault. I have a family. We all have families. Later that evening, Maxim assigned everyone to dining and common area groups. If you can't be civil with each other, this is the way it has to be, he said. I will not tolerate arguments. We have enough to deal with right now. Lately, I can't help but think about all the times the team was covered in mud and water from the crater, of the jury-rigged clean lab, the respirators that probably need their air filter cartridges replaced. I question Dave's decision to inject the virus into a rat, one of history's most notorious vectors for disease. We're told to report anything out of the ordinary. We're told the quarantine is to be extended and to expect supply drops every 2 weeks. We're told biohazard medical teams will be sent if necessary. I fall asleep every night video chatting with my family, telling fairy tales to Yumi, and they all lived happily ever after. I wake up half expecting to find something wrong, a fever, a stiff neck, a rash. I examine every inch of my body in the mirror. We are all waiting for nothing or everything. I dream of going home and holding my family, telling Yumi that her mother has saved her. I dream of the last trip Clara took with us, flying over the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, watching the last remaining wild caribou migrate. When Dave tells me he has a splitting headache, I tell him to take his own advice and not jump to any conclusions. But I tell him this while standing across the room. When Yulia says she has a stomachache, I tell her to drink tea. We'll be okay, I say, but I see the fear in her eyes. Dave tests positive for the new virus with both saliva and blood samples. I don't know if there's anything I can do to help Yulia. In the real world, people comfort themselves with ignorance, politics, and faith, but here in the domes only hard numbers matter. As we've just explored, How High We Go in the Dark begins with an unassuming discovery, only for it to spiral into a global story of resilience, grief, and interconnected lives. From these symptoms of the first outbreak to the ripples it sends through generations, the novel takes us on an intimate journey into how humanity copes with the weight of collective and personal tragedies. It's worth noting that the language in this book can be stark and unflinching, mirroring the rawness of its themes. The occasional harshness in tone only adds to the transparency and authenticity of the characters' experiences. It makes the stories more vivid, more human, and ultimately more profound. This is a novel that dares to ask, how do we endure, and even thrive, through the darkest times? Let us know your thoughts on the excerpt and your takeaways from the themes of the story.